we shall assemble on the mountain. We shall assemble at the throne with our hearts in His presence. We bring an offering of song, glory and honor and dominion unto the Lamb and to the King. Oh, hallelujah, hallelujah. We sing a song of liberty, and will forever sing His praises, and magnify His holy name, surrounded by familiar faces, with heavenly voices will proclaim, and we will join the angel chorus, and sing forever and a day, that Jesus is our Lord and Savior. He is the truth, the life, the way. We shall assemble on the mountain. We shall assemble at the throne, with humble hearts into His presence. We bring an offering of song, glory and honor and dominion unto the Lamb, unto the King. Oh, hallelujah, hallelujah. We sing a song of the redeemed. Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with loving zeal, the poor and them that mourn, the faint and overborne, sin sick and sorrow-worn, whom Christ doth heal. Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with fervent prayer, the wayward and the lost, by restless passions tossed, redeemed at Calvary's cross from dark despair. Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with one accord, with us the work to share, with us reproach to dare, with us the cross to bear, for Christ our Lord. Man of sorrows, one name, for the Son of God who came, ruined sinners to reclaim. Hallelujah, what a Savior, bearing shame and scoffing rude, in my place condemned He stood, sealed my pardon with His blood. Hallelujah, what a Savior, guilty, vile, and helpless we, spotless Lamb of God was He, full atonement, can it be? Hallelujah, what a Savior, lifted up was He tonight, it is keep falling in love with him over and over and over and over again. I keep falling in love with him over and over and over and over again. He gets sweeter and sweeter as the days go by. Oh, what a love between my Lord and I. I keep falling in love with him over and over and over and over again. He keeps blessing me over and over and over and over and over again. He keeps blessing me over and over and over and over and over again. He gets sweeter and sweeter as the days go by. Oh, what a love between my Lord and I. I keep falling in love with him over and over and over and over again. He keeps cleansing me over and over and over and over and over again. He keeps cleansing me over and over and over and over and over again. He gets sweeter and sweeter as the days go by. Oh, what a love between my Lord and I. I keep falling in love with him over and over and over and over again.
I decided for the next few weeks that we're going to focus on one chapter of the Bible, Luke chapter 6. It is just chock full of stuff. It gives us a really meaty look of Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of God, about what God wants for people's lives. And it begins with Jesus causing problems and getting into trouble. And so let me just start out with the first 11 verses of Luke chapter 6. And by the way, over the next few weeks, you're welcome to read it yet and see what's coming. And do your own kind of analysis, and then we'll study it together. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Now, because of their really picky rules, I'm sure they assumed that this was equivalent to harvesting and threshing grain, which was forbidden by their application of the Sabbath law. Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." And he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. 2 Sabbath encounters. Now, we realize by looking at the other gospel accounts that sometimes these things aren't always in the same order. We can assume that probably in Luke they're as close to chronological order as possible. Because Luke had this, he was kind of a historian. He was a physician, but he was very logical in his thinking and very linear. He liked to line things up. I'm not suggesting that Luke had obsessive compulsive disorder, but he was very organized and very neat in the way he did things. But these collections, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have a purpose. Each one of them has a little bit different angle, including mostly the same stuff, mostly the same accounts of Jesus' life. But every single one of them put the things together strategically, or actually I should more accurately say, the Holy Spirit put things together strategically, using the experience and the pen, the vocabulary, and the heart of the authors, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. And so Luke puts these two together, and they really do fit, don't they? You see, the Sabbath actually makes sense. It's one of the Ten Commandments, and it also became an important part of Israel's self-identity. You know, we are the ones who observe the Sabbath, as well as the other commands. Shabbat, to this day, Shabbat is a special day of the week to Israelites, Jews. And the Sabbath restriction, to do no work on the Sabbath, even as God rested on the Sabbath, was given for both a theological purpose and also a humanitarian purpose. It wasn't just an arbitrary imposition on their schedules. In fact, the second telling of the law, Deuteronomy, probably gives the most complete description of the Sabbath. So let me go there with you to Deuteronomy chapter 5. And Moses said, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do." And then he caps it off by saying this: "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Now, this restriction on Saturday is not binding on Christians. But the principle is just as valid as ever. We, and those we work with, and those who work for us, deserve a day of rest. They deserve refreshment. They deserve some downtime. Now, I may have jarred some folks when I said it's not binding on Christians anymore. I know that there's a long-held view that someplace along the way the Sabbath was changed from Saturday to Sunday. But that's not true. The Sabbath is the seventh day of the week, and the first day of the week is Sunday in the calendar that we follow. Now, if you've got some other calendar where you live on another planet and the weeks are 10 days long or 100 days long, it would be different, but nevertheless, still the Sabbath would be the last day of the week. Now, the notion that we should rest is a good one, and I know that those who, through the Protestant tradition, adopted and passed on the idea that Saturday, or that Sunday rather, is the Sabbath, passed laws that forbade stores from being open on Saturday or Sunday rather, which is not a bad thing. It really may not work in our society anymore. Although, if you have a hankering for the best chicken sandwich in the land, don't have it on Sunday. Because Chick-fil-A is not open on Sunday. Never will a Chick-fil-A employee have to choose whether to go to worship God on Sunday morning and spend their day with their family. They never have to ask for Sundays off. They never have to be in conflict about that. And you realize that weekends are the biggest sales days for restaurants. And yet, the founders of Chick-fil-A made that decision early on, right out of the gate, that even if it meant sacrifice, that's what they were going to do. Every year, 40,000 applications go in for a Chick-fil-A franchise. And 100 of them are approved. The Chick-fil-A organization does phone interviews, personal interviews. They talk to your friends and family. They check your background. They see if you have business acumen and experience. They only charge $10,000 for the franchise license. They do get a cut in your proceeds, though. But the average Chick-fil-A restaurant grosses $4 million a year. It is the best performing fast food restaurant. And they're not open on Sundays. Does that tell you anything? So, there's an application to Christians that we need to make sure that we take time to put God first and remember who we are and who He is. And that we spend time just getting relaxed and recentered and refreshed and recreated. You know, recreation, we forgot the term of that. It means recreation. It's a time to get back to who you really are. It's an escape from the rat race. So God knew what He was doing, didn't He? Which makes a lot of sense because He made us. He knows how we're composed. He understands the relationship between the emotion and the intellect and the body. And He knows what it takes for us to function best. And so He set up a system where that would happen for His people. And we are foolish if we ignore that. But unfortunately, what has happened, or what happened by the time of Jesus, is those who were the teachers and the leaders of the religious life of Israel made up some Sabbath nonsense. Things drift. And what happened with the Sabbath regulations is similar to what happens in our society today, with government regulations and business regulations within companies as well. Think about how this process works. Elected representatives pass laws. You know, typically the laws are maybe 10 pages long. They are not terribly specific. Sometimes they're like 1 page long. But then that law is passed on to the implementing agency, who writes the implementing rules. And by the time it comes back, it's a foot thick. You see, that foot thick, that's where the foot thick book of specifications came for a toilet seat that the Pentagon would purchase, for example. There's a famous story of that toilet seats cost $640 for for the Pentagon back in the 1980s. They had so many specifications and regulations that they had to pass that they cost $600. I can't even imagine what that would be like in 2018 dollars. You could probably buy a new car for the cost of a toilet seat, or maybe a good used one. Must have been quite a toilet seat, that's all I can say. We're not going to go into any more detail than that. You know, several years ago, in order to protect consumers, Ohio revised their requirements about opticians renewing their licenses. You know, Brenda has held her optician's license. She worked as an optician for 28 years and then retired 3 years ago, and has been renewing her license every year with the state of Ohio and the national license, so that she could run her little, I mean, when I say little, I mean her microscopic business of dispensing Medicaid classes. And what she learned was that every year she has to take a course on contact lens dispensing. Medicaid does not pay for contact lenses. Brenda will never dispense contact lenses. She can't take an alternative class to get her continuing education unit credits. She has to take the contact lens class. Well, she found a place that she can take it online, and it's virtually the same thing. The test is virtually the same thing. They just change one question every year. But it doesn't cost very much, and it technically fulfills requirements. Somehow, I don't think that was the spirit of the law change. Do you? I don't think so. But that's the way government works. And that's exactly the way the priesthood worked. And that's the way the rabbi system worked. And so they figured somebody has to decide what constitutes work. God says the Ten Commandments, do no work on the Sabbath. What is work? Well, most of us would say, well, I think I know when I'm working, and I think I know when I'm not working. Right? They said, oh, no, that's not good enough. We have to define work. So, we'll get to that in just a moment. I'm getting ahead of myself here. The problem is, with these implementing rules, that sometimes bureaucracy interferes with compassion. Long before God gave the Ten Commandments, He gave a principle that should apply to all, that applies to all of His law, the Ten Commandments and beyond. And it should be the umbrella principle that applies to all the implementing regulations as well. And that is one that you've seen very often from this pulpit. That is Genesis 1:27. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. And so God has a huge personal interest in mankind. Every single human being is cared for and loved by God and has a direct connection with Him because they're made in His image. And so when God looks at you, He sees some of Himself. You know, it's like when you look at your child and you see some of yourself. And that's the way it is with God. And so the law should serve that truth. And that was God's purpose in giving the law. Now, think about this. When you're driving down the road and you see a 20-mile-an-hour school zone speed limit, how do you feel about that? Do you resent it? Is your first inclination to say, oh, it's a waste of my time going 20 miles an hour through here. I'm an excellent driver. I can do 50 and I wouldn't hit a kid. I've got great brakes. I've got big, oversized Brembo brakes on my car. I can stop on a half of a dime. I don't need a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Anybody here have that feeling when you're driving to the school zone? I didn't think so. Didn't think so. In fact, fact, my guess is you're not motivated by getting a speeding ticket. You're not motivated by whether somebody is seeing you. You're motivated by your concern for children. And so you're glad to slow down to 20. And maybe you go even less and annoy the people behind you. But you want to be careful. And a moral, responsible citizen puts the safety of others before himself. And that's the way society works best. And so what Jesus is doing here in Luke 6 is he is confronting a mindless and heartless application of the Sabbath law. The very law that was given so that God's people would not work themselves to death, so that they would have time to rest and have their body get refreshed and their spirit to get refreshed. But over time, they developed that foot-thick book of regulations. They defined how far you could walk on the day of Sabbath, on the Sabbath day. By our measurements, it was 5/8 of a mile. A step beyond that was labor, and you're in violation. Whether or not you can light a lamp. You can't light a lamp on the Sabbath under the regulations, but you could add oil to a lamp that was already lit. You can't cook food, but you could eat the food that you cooked the day before. You can rescue an animal if it falls into a well. But if a human has an injury, you can't do anything to heal it. You can stabilize it, but that's it. If they have a fever, you can't do anything to lower the fever. You can do something so that it doesn't get higher. What? Where does that, why would you even make regulations like that? Well, because that's what bureaucrats do. And you see, when teachers become bureaucrats and they feel that their responsibility is to maintain the institution instead of to teach the will of God and get back to the original purpose of God, that's when these things go awry. And so here, Jesus comes as a Messiah in a china shop. The one who says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's saying, I am Lord of the Sabbath. But anyways, these two cases, let's look at them for just a moment. His disciples were hungry. They're going through the wheat field. They do what is natural. By the way, they were not stealing because part of the societal regulations, the culture was that if you're going through somebody's field, you're welcome to pick fruit off their tree and eat it. Now, if you go and pick a bushel of the fruit, that's one thing. But if you take one apple off the tree to eat it because you're hungry, you're welcome to. Do it, please, you're supposed to. And the same thing with the grain. So they were doing what was allowed and encouraged. But they were doing it on the Sabbath. And the disabled man that was healed on the Sabbath, they really teach us something about how to discern God's original intent. When he says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath, they heard exactly what he said. They heard him say, I am God, and I'm the one who established the Sabbath, and I know what it's for, and I can do what I want to on it, because what I want to will be God's will. They heard him say that. That's why they wanted to kill him. That's why later on he was accused of blasphemy, claiming to be God. He didn't have to say, hey, look at me, I'm God. No, he had other ways of saying it. The Son of Man, which is the way he addressed himself, is the Lord of the Sabbath. Is God, in other words. And you see, that's the way we got to look at it. In all these regulations, we should say, okay, Jesus is the Lord. What is God's will in this area? You know that old phrase from 10 plus years ago, what would Jesus do? That's exactly what he's saying here. We have it in another place as well, John chapter 1. I really like this one. There's a Greek word that I find fascinating, and it says so much, but it's not verse 1. It's, I think it's verse 17. 17 or 18. Somebody can look that up for me. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who was at the Father's side, and here's the phrase, has made him known. He's saying that Jesus, God the Son, reveals God, reveals who he really is. He is the exposition of God. He is the description of God. And so if you have the question, what would God do in this situation? You say, what would Jesus, or what did Jesus do in this situation? And you know what God would do in this situation. He is, the Greek word here is the word from which we get exegesis, which is kind of a Bible student term for the concept of studying the scriptures in order to find out what it says. Not to put your own meaning into it, but to let the truth, the meaning of this text come out and teach you. And so Jesus is the exegesis of God. Now, he shows us how he handles this. First of all, he cites biblical precedent. He said, have you never read what David did? And he goes back to 1 Samuel chapter 21. When David is on the run from King Saul. King Saul is unjustly trying to kill David, who is now God's anointed. He has actually been declared the soon-to-be king of Israel. And Saul is jealous of him. On top of that, an evil spirit has entered into Saul. And Saul goes out of his mind at times. In fact, Saul even tries to kill his own son Jonathan, because Jonathan is the best friend of David. And David, on the run, comes to the high priest at Nob, and he says, can I have some bread? And he said, the only bread I have is the bread of the presence. It's the sacred bread. And he said, I can give you some of it if you are ceremonially clean. And David said, I am. And so he gives him some. Now, technically, it was a violation to give anybody that bread. And yet, he did. And it meets God's approval. And so Jesus cites that as precedent. And then Matthew's account gives us another example from precedent. And it's an interesting way of stating it. Jesus says there, or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? Now, what does that mean? How do the priests desecrate the Sabbath?
They work.
That's right. They work hard on the Sabbath. They slaughter animals. They burn the animals as a burnt offering. Some Sabbaths, they work from sunup until sundown, until exhaustion, on the Sabbath. And so what Jesus is pointing out from that is that the Sabbath regulation is not absolute, that there are always exceptions to it. There are exceptions of necessity and exceptions of humanitarian need. The second principle that Jesus cites his priorities when he says, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath? Because the whole issue is obeying God's law. He said, what is really lawful? To save life or destroy it? To do good or to do evil? And all the time he's saying that, he's got this poor guy who has a shriveled right hand, unable to use it for anything. And how would you answer that question? You know, if you did it theoretically when this guy wasn't around, well, of course it's always best to do good than evil and to save life and not destroy it. And he puts this guy up and he says, essentially, would it be evil for me to heal this man? Now, you know that Jesus could have waited until Monday, right? I mean Sunday. That was the next day. Or he could have done this on Friday. In fact, he could have done it 1 minute before sundown on Friday. And technically not violate the Sabbath law. But he didn't do it. Instead, he walks into the synagogue on the Sabbath to do what he's supposed to be doing on the Sabbath. And here's a man with a shriveled hand. Well, I noticed that the law teachers and the Pharisees don't verbally answer Jesus. I'm sure they give him a look, an evil eye. And I know that you can probably see steam coming out of their ears because they are not happy. But Jesus has them. And then he heals the man. And restores him completely. And shows the glory of God and the power of God. And by the way, he shows that he is God. That he is the healer. He is the one who made that man in his image and can restore him. He is saying, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I need to throw in some caution as we talk about this kind of stuff. Lest we think, you know what? As long as I feel it's the right thing to do, it's okay to do it, even if the law says that I can't do it. That doesn't work either with man's law or God's law. You know, sometimes we just want to throw those rules out because they don't make sense to us or because they inconvenience us. But let's see if I can use this illustration. You have two cars. One of them needs a lot of work, and you've been working on it, and it's taken a little while, so you didn't renew your license plates for insurance. Because you know it's going to take 6 more months to restore the car to where you want it. But you've got it in place that it will run. You've got a second car that's licensed, insured, fully functional. Your wife is away someplace, visiting a friend or whatever, buying groceries or whatever. And so it's not there. And your neighbor runs over and says, my wife just cut her hand seriously. And it's going to take an ambulance 15 minutes to get here. Could you take us to the hospital? And you've got a choice. You can say, you know what? I've got a car that runs, but it has no plates and it doesn't have insurance. I can't do that. Or you can say, of course I will. What would you do? I have no question what I would do. Realizing that if I get stopped by the police, I'll have to pay a fine. I'd be willing to take the consequences of violating the law in order to do something that has a higher priority. Someone could say, well, you know, there could be another way around this. You could run down the street, knock on all the doors, and find somebody that's got a functioning car. In the meantime, the woman is bleeding out. And that's exactly the situation Jesus is describing here. Now, there's a big difference between that and my wife is out of town with the car, and I've just got this on here and my bicycle, and my stomach is growling, and I'm hungry, and I'm thinking, man, I would really like a turtle sundae from the Dairy Queen. You know, it's 10 o'clock or it's 9 o'clock at night, and nobody's going to see me, and if I go back roads, nobody's going to see me, and what are the odds I'm going to get pulled over by the police or get a speeding ticket? It's not going to happen. So I get in my unlicensed, uninsured car, and I drive over, and then I park on West Street, and I walk across the street to the Dairy Queen and get it, and I sneak back home. That is a no-no. That's a no-no. If I do that, I'm violating man's law. And by the way, I'm violating God's law. Because he said in Romans chapter 12 that man has the authority to put those laws into effect. And I'm obligated to respect them. So we have to be careful, because this is not for our convenience. In fact, Jesus in these cases is not ignoring God's law. In fact, he is applying it. He said, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man in another place, in Mark's Gospel. He said, we wrote this law for the benefit of man. And now you're applying it to the detriment of man. That's not right. You see, exceptions to the rule must always be only exceptions. Rare exceptions. But what Jesus is calling us to do is to look higher and say, what is God first of all concerned about? What does he want from us? Does he want us to be the people who say, you know what, I know your family doesn't have any food, but you know, you're doing some stuff that God doesn't agree with, so we're not going to help you. Does God want us to be the people who push people out because they're not where they ought to be? Or who say, every single human being is important to God? You know what? I honestly think that if all of us have the heart that we're supposed to have, and we do what we're supposed to do, that we don't need any laws protecting a minority that has been mistreated. That we don't need all the warnings from the Me Too movement. We don't need the workplace regulations about sexual harassment. If our hearts are where they should be, and we're obeying God and his priorities. Because if that's the case, then if someone declares that they're transgender, or that they're bisexual, or that they're homosexual, or that they're lesbian, we're not going to mock them or make fun of them. We're not going to beat them up. When we find out they are, we're not going to fire them. We're going to treat them with respect. We may not agree with their lifestyle, but we're going to treat them with respect. And if we work in a shop or we work in an office, we're not going to make suggestive and lewd comments to the woman who works next to us. We're not going to proposition our fellow worker. We're not going to slap somebody on the behind. We're not going to try to cop a feel or manipulate somebody into a compromising situation. Not if we have God's priorities. Now, not everybody's in that place, and so that's why those laws come into effect. and they may annoy us, but that's the state of our fallen world. But God's people, we ought to naturally have a concern for everybody. Whether they're right or wrong, whether they're doing right or not, they should have our respect. They should have our compassion. We should have a higher goal for them, even as God does. And we should realize that the only way that that higher goal can be achieved is if we will treat them the way Jesus would treat them. And that's why we see this remarkable thing. When God comes to the earth, the incarnation, God in flesh, and walks among humans, he goes to the house of the Pharisee who's having a dinner party. And a woman of the city comes in and washes his feet with her tears. And he lets her, and he welcomes her, and he holds her up as an example as someone who is doing what God wants. And everyone there is horrified because she doesn't fit their view of how you should treat sinners. And when a woman is caught in the very act of adultery, there's no dispute about that. She was doing it. And she's dragged out to Jesus, trying to test him to see if he will implement the law and have her executed. And what ends up happening is all of her accusers sheepishly slink away. And he says to her, "Woman, where are your accusers?" They're gone. Neither do I accuse you. What? So he just let her get away with this scot-free? No, he didn't. She was condemned enough, self-condemned enough. In fact, he transformed her life. This is not the way people were treated before Jesus came. And as we walk through our world, that's the way we ought to be treating people. Now, it's no wonder so many people in the world have set aside Christianity. They've seen us fight with each other about minute theological points. They've seen us yell at each other because we use the wrong Bible translation. They've seen us quibble and split because of differences in worship styles and in preferences. And they perceive religion as a bunch of picky rules that make no sense. And they want nothing to do with it. And God keeps saying this to us. The first commandment is to love me with everything that you are and have. And the second one is just like it, that is to love people. And all we have to do is just do that. And it starts changing the world. And Jesus brings that before us, doesn't he? In Luke chapter 6.
Every word, let them never from my tongue unbridled slip. May the heart rest impulse ever, check and careless for the lip. Love one another, as in the Savior, children obey the Father's blessed command. Love one another, as in the Savior, children obey the blessed command. Love is much too pure and holy, friendship is too sacred far. For a moment's reckless folly, but to desolate and wrong. Lord